There are some cases, so I've already said I'm not just an effective altruist. I think there's more to being good than just doing the most good. I believe there might be some cases where the humanitarian need is so urgent and so pressing right now that a good person has to respond to it, even if long-term it will do more harm than good. I just think that's a possibility because of the nature and complexity of morality.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where we're very pleased to welcome Professor Larry Temkin. He is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Rutgers University, and his research focuses primarily on normative ethics and political philosophy. His books include Inequality and Rethinking the Good. His upcoming book is called Being Good in a World of Need, and which will be a focus for our discussion today. He also has a variety of published articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, thanks and welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Professor Temkin.
Troy, it's my pleasure to be here, and I don't have anything I need to add. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, so my first question just is a general question about this book. Who is it for? Who is your intended audience, and who would kind of benefit from reading this book, do you think?
So that's a good question. My mom would benefit from reading this book. If she were alive, still to benefit from it. But it's always hard to say who would benefit from a book, who the audience for the book is. This is a complicated book, actually. This was a hard book for me to write because it has a multitude of audiences. There is no single audience for this book. This book was written for people who are concerned about the needy, who are concerned about global need, global poverty, who are concerned about some who are born into tragic circumstances and have been dealt an unfair hand from the day they were born, in comparison with people like my children who were born into the world with every advantage that the world has to offer them, seemingly. It's for those people who care about the needy and who sort of want to help the needy, but they're not quite sure what the extent of their obligations are. And there's a range of people for whom this book is appropriate, and my audience has in mind. They're normal, everyday people who just, think about tithing or giving 10% to charity, to church or something like that. It's students in my classes who take introductory ethics classes, and my classes and those of hundreds of classes around the world every year who teach the topic of obligations to the needy. What do we owe the needy? It's the people who have read Peter Singer, and we might talk more about Peter Singer and his arguments. Peter Singer is, almost certainly the single most influential philosopher in the world today. He's had a profound effect on people's thinking about what we owe the needy and how we should respond to the plight of the needy. It's a response to people who have read Singer or just assume that his view is right. I myself have always assumed something like that. I no longer do. It's written with for organizations, for national and international organizations, charitable organizations, experts in global aid, development economists. There's a whole range of people who might benefit from what goes on in this book to different degrees. So the book really has separate audiences in mind, and it's tricky navigating that in the book, and you might lose either audience by appealing too much to one. I've tried to navigate those waters, but of course only the readers will ultimately tell me whether I've succeeded in doing that. But I just want to add one more thing. I want to jump back in. So one of the audiences for this book is a group called Effective Altruism. There are people who call themselves effective altruists. This has become a very large international movement in recent years that purports to tell us how we should spend make our charitable contributions, what we should have an eye on. And effective altruists are roughly people who think that when you give to charity, you need to give it to the most effective charities in the most effective way that are doing the most good. So basically, you want the most bang for your buck. And I myself have very much seen the effective altruist as on the side of the angels, as is someone like Peter Singer in this debate, but I don't actually accept their view. I have myself helped to launch various effective altruist organizations in this country, in the United States and abroad. I've helped launch the effective altruist organization versions of something called Giving What We Can at Harvard, at Princeton. I've lectured to that group here at my own university at Rutgers, overseas in England at Manchester, in one case with Jeffrey Sachs, the famous economist at Columbia, and in the other case with Peter Singer, and one of the other cases with Peter Singer. So I have very much given lectures that try to convince people we need to go out and we need to help the neediest people in the poorest countries in the world. And I've done it in a way that effective altruists have thought, yes, that's exactly what we want to hear. But the reality is that this book distances my current views from the views that I lectured on. And when I gave those various lectures, I now have a different way of thinking about this topic.
Yeah, very good. It's like a kind of difficult line to find where you want this book to be available or accessible to a general audience, but also have some somewhat more heavy duty philosophy in there that's interesting to the experts. And I think you kind of did pretty well to that end. I thought it was quite
Thanks,
good.
I appreciate that. I will say, yeah, the book is, so when Peter Singer writes his books, like The Life You Can Save or things like that, it's a nice, short, 125-page book. You can kind of sit down at 8 o'clock in the evening, you can be done with it by midnight. And many of the books, Jeffrey Sachs's books, famous, The End of Poverty, similar kind of thing, an easy, accessible, quick read, sit down, start it on one day, finish it that day, or maybe the next. This book, unfortunately, is not that. It's, I don't know where it'll be in print, but in manuscript form, it runs 600 pages. So it's a long book, but it covers a lot of material, and it tries to do it in a way that will be accessible even to the most general of audiences.
Yeah. And I think how because recently I had an interview with Vittorio Buffacchi on his new book, or relatively recent book, on philosophy during COVID. And there he explores a lot of how we should think about what's been going on in terms of injustices, in terms of violence, in terms of responses to the pandemic and so forth, philosophically. And it makes me think, reading this book, like this might be maybe a better time than ever for writing a book like this, right? Is it now more than ever we need to be good in a world of need, do you think?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's now more than ever. We have needed to worry about this question more or less since we came down from the trees, for those of us who believe we came down from the trees, which I think is most of the audience for this kind of a lecture. But these kinds of questions are old. I mean, they're old. When I lecture in my introductory ethics class, and I lecture on obligations to the needy, I go back to the Bible. I go back to, Genesis and Leviticus, and I talk about the holiness code. And, it's very interesting when you look at the most important, the list of things that you need to do to be holy, to be God-like, as it were. Way up on the list before thou shalt not steal, or even thou shalt not kill, is thou shalt take care of the widow and the orphan. And don't exactly don't ask me for the exact quote, I don't have it to hand, but it's in the Holiness Code. I believe it's in Leviticus. It comes early on. You look at the list of things, the do's and the don'ts, and what you need to do. And way up, it's like, you need to leave the gleanings of the field for the widow and the orphan. You need to take care of those in need. So the issue of taking care of those in need, is as, old as humanity. There's always been, Jesus famously claimed, the meek shall always be, the poor shall always be with us. But that didn't mean we shouldn't do anything about the poor. It's telling us a state about the condition of humanity. So it's always been there. But what's particularly striking now, and this may be what prompts your question in some sense, is that in the modern era, it seems like so much of the pain and suffering that goes on in the world, it seems, is just unnecessary. Like, for a long time, if someone came down with a terrible disease, there was just nothing you could do about it. You pitied them and you watched them die. But now there's so much that human beings are capable of doing to redress, the most painful circumstances. Francis Bacon, right, talked about, the heart of the Enlightenment project. Francis Bacon, in many ways, the father of the Enlightenment project, was the amelioration of the human condition. It was attempting to make life on earth go as well as possible for humans. And among the other goals that he had, this incredible lofty goal, way back when he was writing hundreds of years ago, was literally the elimination of disease, suffering, hunger, and possibly even death. And to a large extent, most of those goals seem right there in front of us. We live in this enormously wealthy world. There's so much wealth in this world. It's unbelievable. And yet, despite all this wealth and all this incredible technological progress that we've made and all these jumps forward, not just incremental, but leaps forward in the realms of health and so on, we have all these people who are in some cases left behind and other people who are pushed behind. And so what seems pressing now in a way it never has been before is that you can hear about people on the other side of the world, and it seems like there's no need for them to be born with a life expectancy of 5 years old, or whatever the number is, a life expectancy of 31, but only because many of them won't make it past their 5th birthday. That just seems like preposterous that in a world as wealthy as ours, there should be so much pain and suffering and seemingly avoidable death. And that's what makes this problem today, so poignant and so pressing. Like, it seems like we could do something. Why aren't we doing it? And I feel that force. I felt that force my whole life. And I continue to feel it. And of course, what I agree with, of course, I didn't hear your interview, but what's certainly true, I have a part of the prologue in my book where I do talk a little bit about COVID. And I do talk about how COVID is such a reminder of, these inequalities. These massive inequalities, who gets affected by it, disproportionately in the United States, but also elsewhere. It's the poor. It's the disenfranchised. In the US, it's African Americans and Hispanics, overwhelmingly so. It's the old, it's the weak. Who gets affected by it? And then also, who has the resources to combat it? And of course, the rich countries, scoop up all these massive amounts of vaccines, and they leave much, much less for other countries that need it every bit as much in the face of COVID and everything else.
Right. Yeah, it's like COVID, the pandemic has brought to light, in a way, a lot of the misfortunes that people have endured, including some injustices that have sort of present in societies, and letting people know how they can, or maybe even might be obligated to help, is worthwhile. So let's see. I had a question about, in the beginning part of the book, you make a few methodological points. And one is how you want to take seriously like intuitions that we have. And that's something frequently relied upon in moral theorizing. And I was wondering, it's kind of, as I see it, there's like two main purposes for intuitions in this sort of thing. One is for sort of guiding the concepts that we're going to employ. If we want to have, if our concept of such and such is meant to track certain intuitions we have, then we want to kind of explore those intuitions to figure out the concept. On the other hand, we might think that our intuitions are not meant to be guiding our concepts, but like letting us know substantive truths, like they really are tracking the truths, at least somewhat reliably, or at least somewhat reliably in a particular domain. Do you kind of understand the two different approaches I have in mind for intuitions here? And what do you think about
Sure. Okay, so this is a huge question. It's a really important question. It's a particularly important question for field of philosophy, which many of your listeners will know about, the field of metaethics, which is what is the status of intuitions in ethics or elsewhere. I have a great deal to say about that, but I'm going to really try to answer your question in a slightly different way, which is without trying to actually take on the huge metaethical question about where the truth lies in this domain, though I will tell you what I think. I want to say that in a way it doesn't matter for my purposes, for the purposes of a book like this. When I teach my introductory ethics class, for example, and I teach contemporary moral problems, and I teach topics like abortion and punishment, capital punishment, obligations to the needy, just war, a wide variety of issues. I put my cards on the table that I am myself an objectivist about ethics. I mean, there are some things that are right and there are some things that are wrong, and they're objectively right or wrong. It's not just a matter about my feelings. It's not just a matter of my projecting on the world what my desires are or something like that. I mean, my own view is that there are truths. There are irreducible normative truths that don't depend on my interests, desires, my inclinations, and so on. Okay, so they're true independently of my wants or hopes or beliefs. So I do believe that. And I do believe that to a certain extent, though it can be, as it were, corrupted in a wide variety of ways, our intuitions about ethics we should take at face value as indicators of what's likely to be true, though that's defeasible. There's a lot of intuitions that people have had in the past that we've now come to see, you have that intuition, but that's just wrong. And we can often give a social, cultural, historical explanation for why they had that intuition, but was nonetheless mistaken. And many people's intuitions over the years about race, about slavery, about sexual practices, we now look back and we say, with a gasp, and say, how could anybody think that? Even the greatest philosophers in the world, right? I mean, Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers in the history of Western thought that masturbation was a sin. A sin. So, a lot of us think, you're a brilliant man, but, I wouldn't put too much weight on that intuition. Okay. So I do think, as a matter of fact, that intuitions are a first step. We want to organize, we want to systematize, we want to try to explain our intuitions as far as we can. But the thing is, the big divide in this domain is roughly between, as it were, objectivists who believe there are irreducible normal truths about ethics that don't depend on our interests, desires, and inclinations, and subjectivists. Subjectivists roughly do think that morality is a social convention. It's something that human beings agree to. If we had different agreements, then what would be right or wrong would be different. There's lots of variations of this kind of theory. It's a respectable theory of moral philosophy. It's not the one I share, but it's a very powerful and important view. And it's not easy to show that it's wrong. In fact, it could well be right, even though I don't think it is right. But even if the subjectivist is right, and this is why I want to say, in a way, I want to finesse this question for the purposes of this book, or much of what I do when I think about ethics. Even if the subjectivist view is right, And ultimately, morality comes down to, as it were, what we want or what we desire. All the questions raised in this book and all the questions that one raises in introductory ethics class are just as important. Because the question is, on that view, what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to raise our children? What kind of mores do we want to instill in our children? Do we want to tell them that you can just utterly ignore the weak? Can we tell them that we want them to utterly ignore the poor, the downtrodden? There are people who are starving over there, and in theory, and you could help them at little or no cost to yourself, but it doesn't matter. Is that the kind of world we want to live in? And when you think about, even if you think of morality as a communal enterprise, you think about what kind of world do I want to live in? What kind of community do I want to build? Matthew wrote a book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. Even if you believe that ethics is an invention, still we want to build one edifice rather than another. And I myself have no doubt there's certain components I want in my edifice. And that things that I want to try to teach my children and raise my children to care about. And that includes being virtuous, that includes being loyal, that includes being honest and trustworthy and dependable. And that's something I want for the world I live in, for my community, and for the community that my children will be a part of. And so even if I thought, as it happens, my own view, as I say, I'm an objectivist. So I don't think it's merely something I want. I think it's something I ought to want because it's true. That you ought to be virtuous, that you ought to be charitable, that you ought to be dependable and reliable, and so on. I think there's a whole bunch of oughts that are genuinely true that don't depend on my interests or desires. But the important thing to recognize is that we humans are social animals. We not only can discover things about the world, we can create ourselves and the world. We can modify ourselves and the world now more than never before. And in light of that, we have this pressing question. How do we want to modify ourselves? How do we want to modify our world, right? Suppose there's no objective morality at all. Does that mean that we should not care at all about climate change and whether or not the future will come to an end in 100 years? I see no reason to think that. I mean, so I'm going to care about whether the future comes to an end in 100 years, whether or not I think there's an objective truth about morality. And I trust most of the readers of the book are going to think that too. So your question is a really important one. I put weight on intuitions. I think intuitions matter because I think they are, as it were, the data points that ethicists have to deal with in constructing their theories. We want to capture them, we want to accommodate them, we want to explain them as much as possible. But I don't take our intuitions as sacrosanct. They're always subject to revision in light of reflection and reasons and arguments and conflicts with other intuitions and so on. So I hope that helps give you some sense.
Yeah, no, that's very good. I personally am someone who leans more to that subjectivist side, but I didn't see any assumption in this book against that. I mean, it seems to be perfectly applicable to regardless of your metaethical approach, so long as you have some of the common commitments that
that's right
to go into.
That's right. And I mean, if you don't, Thomas Nagel pointed out a long time ago. I mean, many people have pointed this long before Tom, but Tom had this argument where he says, when the brutes come to your door, and you say, wait, this isn't reasonable. What kind of an answer is that, right? It may not be an answer at one level. It's not reasonable. So what? They don't give a shit whether it's reasonable, right? But nonetheless, for many of us, we want to construct a world. We want to create a world where the brutes aren't coming to your door. That's important to us. That's what we care about. That's what helps give meaning to our lives to create such a world. So we're trying to figure out for ourselves either what values are there, which I see as my task, or what do I value and how do I try to help make the world realize those things that matter to me a lot. And I do think this book is pitched towards those many, many, many people who do care about the fact that many people are born with a really bad hand. And it seems like we can do something about it. And the book is pitched towards those who want to be good in a world of need, but they're not sure what that means and what that commits them to and how they should go about accomplishing that. And I'm trying to raise some questions about some of the standard views that many people in philosophy have had about that question that I have long thought were true, but I no longer think are true.
Yeah, awesome. And throughout this book, you consider a lot of different thought experiments, moral dilemmas, and so forth, including Peter Singer's famous pond example. And although it is significant, I take it that you're a little bit critical of how much we can really learn from that, how much we can draw from that in terms of a general ethical commitment, especially with respect to aid and charity. And maybe if you could talk about that briefly, and also, I don't know, I had this idea that, or I often have this idea that in a lot of these thought experiments, things are really simplified. Our epistemic situation is very much fixed. There's not a lot of unknown variables, but in real life, it doesn't work like that. So yeah, I don't know, maybe if you could talk on this briefly, it would be.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Troy. So for those members of your audience who maybe have heard of Singer, but maybe haven't read his example, or you haven't seen him talk where he gives an example, let me just briefly give what his example was and what he claimed seemingly followed from it, and what other peoples have thought followed from it, and then suggest why I just don't think that's right anymore. I used to think something like this was right, but I no longer do. So the famous pond example was very simple. It went like this. You're walking by the pond. I'll update it slightly, but you're walking by the pond and you see a drowning child, and you're the only one there. And the child is either going to drown or you can wade in after him. And in the original example, you can, if you wade in, you know that your new shoes and your clothes are going to be ruined because it's a very muddy pond and they're brand new shoes and maybe it's worth $300. We'll update it, make it anyway. So you're going to walk in and you're going to ruin your shoes and your clothes. And he says, nobody has any doubt whatsoever that the right thing to do is to wade in and save the drowning child. And that's right. I mean, we all agree with that. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're an objectivist or a subjectivist. None of us are walking by the pond and we see a drowning child, and you'd have to be, a psychopath or a misanthrope, or you'd have to be disturbed in a serious way to not go in and save the drowning child, even if will in fact ruin your clothes and it's going to cost you something. And then Peter basically says, but look, they're the equivalent of drowning children all over the world. There are people right now who will die on the other side of the world, in Chad, in Somalia, in wherever it is, name your favorite place where children or non-children are in great need. And you could send a check, he says, to an effective aid organization like Oxfam, he says. And when you send that check, they can deliver that aid, so he claims, almost as effectively as you can save that child. So here, it's going to cost you relatively little, let's say $300 or $500, whatever it would be. That's not going to make a significant difference in the quality of your life. And you can save a child's life. Isn't it clear that you want to do that? And then he says, well, morality says that there's nothing special about this child. You ought to be neutral between this child and any other child who could use your help. And if you really could write a check for $300 or $500, whatever the value is of the clothes that would be ruined, to an effective aid organization, and they could, in fact, aid someone like a child on the other side of the world via some kind of interaction, just as effectively as you could actually pull them out of the water, then surely you have a moral obligation to do it. What's the difference between those? Either way, it costs you a small amount that was going to make no difference to your overall affluent lifestyle. He's speaking to those of us who are moderately well off in the West, and it's going to make a difference to his child's life. Those two are the same, he says, from any standard of morality that treats people impartially. Right? There's nothing special about the child in the pond that he or she has a right to life, but the child in Somalia doesn't. And if that's the case, then clearly, if we have an obligation, if it would be deeply wrong of us to ignore the child who's drowning in the pond, then it's deeply wrong of us to ignore the child that we know is drowning on the other side of the world, that we could easily help if only we got them vitamin A tablets or mosquito bed nets or some food. So that's the basic argument. And many people have been persuaded by it. And it has led to a very simple sort of thought. I mean, you look at this case and you have a drowning child, and then you have a person who could help them. And you're going to help this person a lot. It's going to cost me basically nothing. It's going to cost me basically nothing. I'm going to help them a lot. And I ought to do it. That was the thought. And it seems to follow from that we all have an obligation, or at least we all ought to send money to effective aid organizations like Oxfam, that international relief organizations like Oxfam that are effective. That was his argument. And as I say, that's been a massively influential argument. Now, effective altruists came along and they saw that argument and they basically took it and they pumped it up. They thought that's basically right, and let's just add this other coda. Suppose we could, help one drowning child, or we could help 4 drowning children for the same amount. Clearly, 4 drowning children, each of them has just as much right to life as the one drowning child. If for the same effort and the same amount, we could save 4 drowning children rather than one, that's clearly what we ought to do. So the effective altruists say, basically, when you give to a charity, it's very important that you make sure that you give to the most effective charities, so as to make sure that you're doing the most good that you can. And this has very important real life implications. Because, for example, it could well be the case that, there are charities out there that for a long time were focusing on helping small children with AIDS. But in the early days, it was very expensive to help someone with AIDS. So it might cost you, let's just arbitrarily make up a number, $500 to save a single child with AIDS. But with that same $500, you might be able to purchase a whole bunch of oral rehydration tablets that would prevent 10 children or more from suffering from dehydration and dying as a result. And then if your choice is between one child who will die from AIDS or 10 children who will die from dehydration, for the same amount, you ought to save 10 rather than 1. So you ought to give to the most effective charities, say the effective altruists, in order to do the most good. And what I basically do in this book is suggest that it's intuitively powerful, and it does seem like an intuition, as those are right, and this gets back to your point, Troy, that you pick up on reading the book, that there are a lot of disanalogies between the child who is drowning in the pond and giving to an effective aid organization on the other. That's going to help people on the other side of the world. And we can assert, Peter can assert, and Peter's I consider him a good friend and I admire him enormously. But, he can say that an effective aid organization can help a child on the other side of the world as effectively as I can help the child here. But it's easier said than done. And this is what I point out over and over again in the book. And one of the things I also point out is against the effective altruist, to see why you can't infer from our intuitions about the drowning child case to anything about effective altruism. Just change the example one bit. I'll just give this and I'll pause, let you jump back in. So suppose I'm walking by, and I'm going to update it a little bit. I have a very fancy gold watch that was bequeathed to me by a favorite uncle. And it's very fancy. I don't have very many fancy things in my life, but I have this. It was a favorite uncle and I really love it. And it's worth like $10,000, and it's an amazing watch. And because it's so expensive, it has this very intricate clasp, so intricate that it's very difficult for a single person to get it on or get it off. So I really need my significant other to help me get it on in the morning and take it off at night. And now I'm walking by the pond and I see a child drowning. And there the child is right in front of me and the child is drowning. And my first thought is, oh my gosh, the child is drowning. I have to jump in and save that child. And then I think to myself, just as I'm about to save them, but wait, I've got this really expensive watch on my hand, on my wrist. If I jump in, I'm going to ruin the watch. That's worth $10,000. And then I have another thought. It's like, all right, $10,000 is a lot because I don't have a lot of money, but still, it's the life of a child versus this thing, a watch. I ought to just save the child. Now, at that point, I think if you're a good and decent person, remember the title of my book, Being Good and World Lead, if you're a good and decent person, that's the end of the thinking. You jump in and you save the child, and it's too bad if you destroy your watch. That's unfortunate, too bad. Notice, I haven't said anything about whether you have an obligation to save the child. I just think there would be something wrong with you if you didn't save the child. But now, suppose just as I'm about to jump in, I have another thought. Wait a minute, this is a really expensive watch. Maybe I shouldn't save the child. I should wait. I should let the child drown. That's unfortunate. I don't want that to happen. I should go home. I should get the watch off me. I should then sell it for $10,000. I should give the proceeds to an effective charity. And I've read about several effective charities who for $10,000 could save 3 children. Now, here's what I believe. I do have a very firm intuition in Singer's original case that I ought to save the drowning child. I have that same intuition in this last case. There's the child drowning. If I have the thought, oh, well, that's really unfortunate, but if I save this, I don't ruin this precious watch, and then I send it to an effective child, I'll save 3 children instead of 1, and 3 is more than 1. I think there'd be something wrong with you to be entertaining that thought, and something wrong with you if you acted on that thought. There's that child right now in front of you. You ought to save it, I think. So it's not just about doing the most good that you can. The effective altruists say, whatever you do, you ought to act with an eye towards doing the most good that you can. I think there's much more to being good than just doing the most good that you can. There are many factors that are relevant to being a good and decent human being. One of them is promoting a lot of good, but one of them is being virtuous, being generous, and being benevolent, and being sympathetic, and having all these various other factors, which I believe would drive someone who saw a child who's drowning right there in front of them in a face-to-face confrontation to do what they're compelled to do, which is to go and save that child. But the other thing is, and now I'll pause to let you jump into the conversation, but the other thing is, as you rightly pointed out, there's so many factors when it's just me and the child that I don't have to worry about, that I do have to worry about when it's me giving money to an international relief organization, which will then do something on the other side of the world. There's so many disanalogies that it turns out the simple equation, which I always thought about this issue in terms of was basically 2 elements involved. How much does it hurt me to do it? Almost nothing. How much would it help someone else? A lot. I always thought if it would hurt me almost nothing, it would help someone else a lot, then clearly I ought to do it. But it turns out in the real world, for reasons we can talk about, it's rarely just me and this person that would be saved that are impacted by these actions. There's a whole slew of other people who are or could be affected by the interventions. Disanalogies of how many people are in the path, the worries about internal corruption, worries about what I call external corruption, giving money to international relief organizations that are going to have to work with corrupt despots, dictators, gang leaders on the ground. And when you work with those people, you end up often not because you want to, but indirectly supporting them and their political agendas. So you're helping this person in need, but you only can help them by buttressing the position of gangsters and despots, and then they can go on and put other people in need and harm other people. There's all these other kinds of factors that can arise in the case of aiding someone on the other side of the world via contributions that don't arise in one contribution. And I'll make one more case. There's economic incentives, what we call perverse incentives that can arise at a variety of levels when aid flows in from the outside to a given place, particularly a poor place, particularly a poor place that is governed by corrupt leaders. There's all these perverse incentives that can arise. But also what people don't pay attention to is if I go into a poor country and I have lots of money and I want to help people, I'm going to hire the best local help that I can. I'm going to hire people who are smart and dedicated and dependable and reliable and efficient and good managers. I'm going to hire those people because that's how I'll accomplish my good goal of maybe aiding people with AIDS. But where do those local people come from? Those local people might currently have jobs, let's just say, in the government. They might be engineers who are designing bridges. They might be engineers who are working on solutions for not having clean water. They might be nurses and doctors who are working in clinics, maybe small clinics that they're the only clinic covering virtually all of Kibera, the largest slum in Africa, and the third largest slum in the world. They might be playing a crucial role, but I come in from the outside and I have better working conditions, higher salaries, and I entice these people to work for me. Well, the international aid agencies point out all the good that they do with their money, with the money that you give them. And they really are doing good with that money when they hire all these people. But what else might these people have been doing in the system that they're not doing now because of what we call these perverse incentives? And there could be deleterious effects, in some cases, large deleterious effects that nobody tracks. So if what you really want to do is help people in need, you can't just pay attention to me and the person who's being helped. You have to pay attention to the indirect effects of everybody else that's affected by the interactions of outside aid agencies. And this can be quite significant.
Yeah, that's, I agree completely with that. And you talk about, as you mentioned, different sorts of corruption that can occur, different conflicts of interest, different, as well in the book, you have this chapter on issues with what you call ethical imperialism, which I found to be a very interesting discussion, among other things. On that, I thought that discussion was very important, although it is a very difficult topic. I'm sure you agree. So, like sometimes the aid we think would help some group or some people, or the means we think best facilitate it are insensitive or to differences in culture and tradition and so forth, and could lead to the partial or even complete rejection of that aid by those we're trying to help. And it's kind of like two connected issues here, at least. One is, the first involves whether that, culture or tradition is in itself valuable and something that should be preserved, right? And the second is, involves whether we can reasonably expect a lack of cooperation or receptivity and so forth by the given the actions we intend to make. And so, I mean, it may be that what's ultimately best for someone is only rationally provided to them if we can reasonably expect that they'll be receptive of it. And, among other things. Of course, it's a complicated issue, and that's only one consideration and so forth. Do you think that's right? Or maybe speak briefly on this difficult issue?
Yeah, so let me say, there's a lot going on in this question and a lot going on in the chapter that you're referring to about ethical imperialism. So you pointed to two things that are both very important, and I'll briefly touch on them, but there's a third thing as well. And this gets into complex questions about what I call roughly autonomy or respect, valuing the ideals of autonomy and respect, as opposed to just paternalism. So when people from the outside come in and they want to help other people. So I put this in the context of a chapter that starts, I don't remember the exact title, but it's ethical imperialism and various other things. So there's a rich, rather dark, unhappy tradition in the West of imperialism, of going in to other countries and imperialism, colonialism, hegemony. We're trying to make other countries like us, right? England is held up as the exemplar of this par excellence, but they're hardly the only one. England, France, Belgium, the United States, and lots of Germany, lots of countries were engaged in imperialism and colonialism. And they would go into various other countries. And some of it was just straight exploitation, right? I mean, they're just, they're abusing the natives. Oftentimes they put them on reservations. Oftentimes they involved kicking them out of their own homes. Oftentimes there was extermination going on of the local natives. But in addition to all of that, there were a bunch of people who were engaged in imperialism who actually went in with the thought that Rudyard Kipling made famous, the blessed liege, those of us who have much have this obligation to help the poor, benighted savages. And that was the thought. They're savages and we're civilized and we can help them and bring them civilization. We're going to bring them roads, we're going to bring them schools, and we're going to bring them, our literature and so on. And the cost of this, of course, well, there's many, many, many costs, but among other things, it's an utter lack of respect for their way of life, for what matters to them, for what they value. We're basically saying when we did that, I say we, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and actually into this century, people were doing that. It was the thought that we are superior and they are inferior, right? Now, a lot of times in the modern era, when people are going in to help people who are badly off in other places of the world, they're not saying to themselves, oh, we're superior, you're inferior, we're the civilized country and you are savages. But in fact, we are often conveying a message that what you're doing in your country is backward. It's primitive. Sometimes it's barbaric. And it's not what you ought to be doing. And this happens again and again and again. And very often, the aid efforts run up smack against local ways of life where people just don't value what we value. And now, as I've said already, I'm not in fact an ethical relativist. So I am in fact an objectivist. So I'm prepared to recognize that some of the things that aid workers are working for, and I'll name a few of the kinds of things I have in mind here, that there are objectively good reasons to do that. Child brides, right? Polygamy and child brides is a very common thing in many, many, many countries of the world where we go in and we want to aid. And we want to bring education to the young girls. And we want to empower the young girls. And a lot of the ways that you would bring education and empower the young girls, and that's a valuable goal. Please don't misunderstand me as I say this. This is a very valuable goal. I approve of it. Nonetheless, it may run contrary to a rich history that extends back hundreds and hundreds of years or more, and to what many people on the ground themselves value. And we can get into questions about, well, they have the wrong values. They have false consciousness. They don't actually understand what's good for them, but that's my whole point. We are making a judgment about what is or isn't good for them. And it's a judgment that they or themselves may not make. Female circumcision. I regard that as a brutal activity. I think there ought not to be female circumcision, but it's a part of the cultural way of life that extends back for long periods of time in many, many tribes and cultures. And we're going in there and we're saying, oh no, it's not healthy. It's not good for the young women. We need to change it. And we give them a combination as outsiders of carrots and or sticks. If you want our aid, you can't engage in this. You don't want to get aid. So we want you to take, we want you to use condoms. And then there are local customs where the men don't want to use condoms. And we're saying, well, you ought to use condoms. It's better for you. We are making a judgment about what's better for you. Now, the trickiness here is that we don't have to be thinking that they're inferior and we're superior, but we are, in essence, often going in and trying to change their current way of life for the better. We think it's for the better. And there's a question of whether in doing so, we are engaging in a practice, a kind of ethical imperialism. We are trying to bring what we regard as the right way of life, the better way of life, to people who are not currently engaged in it. And whatever the truth is about all things considered, whether we should do that, there are costs to doing so. And there are deontological costs to doing so. Because one of the factors is it's not clear that we are, in fact, respecting their autonomy or their right to make choices for themselves about how they want to act and the practices they want to engage in. When we coerce actively, directly, or indirectly, sometimes just by offering them carrots to change their way of life. So this is an issue, again, that I think we need to think about. It certainly doesn't arise at all when we think about saving a child who's drowning in the pond. When we think about saving a child and drowning in the pond, we're not making any moral judgments about the way of the life of the child or the practices they're engaged in, about whether or not they're engaged in an unhealthy lifestyle other than drowning is unhealthy. None of that. There's none of that implicit condemnation of another worldview. But it's very hard to avoid the implicit condemnation of another worldview when we come from the outside with our ways of fixing what's wrong with them. They kind of go part and parcel, and that's a cost. Now, in some cases, it might be a cost worth bearing. This is not therefore we can't engage in such practices, even if it has these costs. But they're costs that we have to pay attention to. And all too often, I believe they're ignored when we think about how to be good in a world of need. You want to be good, you want to help others, but you want to help others in a way that respects their autonomy and doesn't contribute to the end of a way of living that they value. And I'm not so sure that we do that so effectively all the time.
Yeah, very good. That's a great explanation of that. And it gets very tricky. I agree. So I wanted to move on to another thing that you discussed that I found really interesting, because I've independently have a lot of interest in like decision theory and stuff like that, and that comes up here. Yeah. And you have a discussion on, especially on these like each we dilemmas. So like, and how even on consequentialism, what would be recommended for the individual is in conflict with what might be recommended for the group, right? It's rational for each person to do this, but nevertheless, it's not rational for everyone in the group to do that, and so forth. I wanted to, maybe if you wanted to get some comments on that, but and then I'll ask a follow-up on that.
Yeah. So here you're putting your finger on the philosophically most important contribution of this book. It's a topic that I've worked on a lot in the context of my previous book, Rethinking the Good. And I have a distinctive contribution in this area that I think is relevant to this topic of being good in the world of need. And the background to this is to introduce another factor that I haven't yet talked about, but it's very important for this conversation. So there's an economist. His name is Angus Deaton. He's a brilliant economist. He taught at Princeton for many, many years. He's now emeritus. And he has been arguing for a number of years that people like Peter Singer, and by extension, to a much lesser extent, people like Larry Temkin for all those years, when I was arguing to these effective altruist organizations and saying, you need to give money, he's basically been claiming that Peter Singer is doing more harm than good. Peter Singer and his followers are doing more harm than good. And most of us find it really hard. That's just really hard to believe. How can we be doing more harm than good if we give money to an effective altruist organization who's going on the other side of the world and saving lives. I've hinted at some of the ways we might be doing more harm than good if some of the money that we send over there gets, siphoned off into the hands of a corrupt dictator who then uses that to buy bullets to kill other people. That could be a way you're doing more harm than good. But still, it's really hard to get your head around it, especially given the nature of the explanation that he gives. Because Angus basically believes that the single most important thing for long-term, sustained social, political, and economic success in a country or a region is that you have a government that's responsive to the will of its citizens. And what he believes is that when money from the West, typically the West, pours into very poor countries, it tends to undermine the responsiveness of the government to its citizens in a variety of ways. And if it does undermine the responsiveness of the government to its citizen in a variety of ways, then that can have devastating effects, since a local government that's responsive to its citizens is, according to Deaton, absolutely crucial for long-term, sustainable social, economic, and political progress. And you could see why this would be. Because whatever we from the outside might do in the standpoint of charity, it's a government that oversees the projects like major infrastructure, roads, energy, hospitals, education. The government does that. And if you undermine the responsiveness of the government to its citizens, so that it doesn't have to pay so much attention to its citizens because of the influx of funds from the outside for a variety of reasons, that can have a massive effect on the entire population. Well, so now there's this theorizing that's been done by a whole host of economists and philosophers on what are called prisoners' dilemmas, which has led us to understand an area that Derek Parford dubbed each we dilemmas. And these are cases where if each of us acts in our own best interests, we together are worse off. And it turns out that there's a gazillion such cases. If each of the farmers brings as many crops to market as he can, that will be best for him or her, no matter what any of the other farmers do. But if they all bring as many crops to market as they can, that will collapse the price of the crops, and that will be worse for everybody. If each of us, fails to pay our taxes, that will be better for us, no matter what anybody else does. But if we all fail to pay our taxes, there are no hospitals and there are no roads and there's no, any war, soldiers and, civil defense and so on, and that will be worse for everybody. There's 100 cases of what are called each we dilemmas. If each of us acts in our own best interest, we together are worse off. Now, it turns out that Derek Parford showed that there could be, those are what are called prudential dilemmas. Each of us does what's best for ourselves. We together are worse off in prudential terms. Derek Parford showed that there can be moral dilemmas of the same kind for what are called deontological theories. If each of us acts rightly according to a deontological theory, we together may do worse in terms of that very theory. So, for example, deontology says I have a special obligation to my own children. So I have a special obligation to save my child rather than two strangers. Well, suppose I'm in a situation where I can save one of my children or three of yours. And suppose you're in a situation where you can save one of your children or three of mine. Deontology says, and suppose I have 4 children, you have 4 children, they're different ones. So I'll save one and you'll save 3 different ones, or I'll save 3 of yours and you'll save a different one of yours. Now, I can either save my child or 3 of your children. And you can save 1 of your children or 3 other of my children. It turns out that according to deontology, I have a special obligation to my own child. So I have to save my 1 child rather than your 3 children. That's true for me and that's true for you. But if each of us does what's best in deontological terms, each of us acts rightly in saving the most number of their own children that they can, Each of us has only one of our children saved instead of three. The one I save by my own hand, rather than the three you might have saved, and the one you saved by your own hand, rather than the three I might have saved. So there can be each we dilemmas in morality as well as prudence, what's best for me. And my distinctive contribution to this debate is I argue in my book, Rethinking the Good, that there can be what are called consequentialist each we dilemmas too. Where if you want to do the most good, it could be the case that each of us acts rightly in consequentialist terms by doing the most good that we can, but we together bring about a worse outcome than if we hadn't. And then going back to now Angus Deaton's point, Angus Deaton says Peter Singer and others, his followers, are acting wrongly or bringing about a worse outcome by giving to international relief organizations because of the deleterious effects that these outside funds have on the responsiveness of the government to its citizens. But a lot of us find that really hard to believe. We think, look, the choice is between, my saving an individual person. That's how much is that going to undermine the responsiveness of a government to its citizens when I give $300 to, save a child? It seems insignificant. Of course, the government is going to impact lots and lots and lots and lots of people, but the extent to which I'm going to undermine the responsiveness of the government to its citizens by my $300 is going to be extremely small. So intuitively, and this may be a mistake, by the way, where intuitions go wrong, but intuitively, we think I can for sure save one individual, make a significant difference in life, or a teeny tiny less responsive to lots and lots of people. That's going to have almost no impact in their lives. Now, a key premise here, this is a long argument, it's a complicated argument, but the key premise is here, many people, including many consequentialists, accept a position which I call a dispersed additional burdens view. And it basically says something like this. If you could have a large amount of burden, and it all is going to fall on one person, so it makes a really negative impact on the quality of their life, or it's going to impact lots and lots and lots and lots of people, a teeny tiny bit. We think more or less, no matter how many people are affected, a teeny tiny bit, it's better that they each be adversely affected a tiny bit than that one person suffer enormously. And I call this the dispersed additional burdens view, and I illuminate with an example which I call the lollipops for lives case. It goes like this. There's two ways the world might go. In one, there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people who all have enormously great lives. But there's one person who suffers terribly for 80 straight years, suffer, and then at the end of an 80-year life, they die a slow, painful, excruciating death. So that's one world. The other world, everybody is enormously well off, almost exactly as enormously well off as in the first world. There's deep loves, fantastic achievements, scientific achievements, appreciation of beauty, whatever else you think really, really matters, great friendships, they're all there. But each of those many people who would have been there in the first case in the second world, they get one less lick of a lollipop over the course of their 80-year life. But nobody suffers horribly for 80 years and dies a slow, painful, horrible death. That person is just as well off as everyone else. So two alternatives. In one, lots and lots and lots of people are extremely well off, and they'll have one extra lick of a lollipop over the course of their lives. But one person suffers horribly. And in the other, everybody's incredibly well off. Nobody suffers horribly. But they get one less lick of a lollipop the rest of them. Almost all of us believe if these were going to be, suppose we were going to have millions of billions of children, and all of our children was going to be one of those two worlds, we'd all want the second world for our children. And most of us think then we should all want the second world for even strangers. over the first. It's just a better world. And that's supported. And we think that no matter how many people are missing one leg of the lollipop. So I call that the dispersed additional burden view. Now that's a view that most people accept, the overwhelming majority of people accept, not everybody, but almost everybody. And even consequentialists accept that. That's a better outcome, they think. But now we get to this problem of each we dilemmas. So imagine that if I make a contribution, it's going to slightly reduce, right? You know, the responsibility of governments towards citizens, but only by a teeny tiny amount. But I save a life. Seems like I ought to do that, no matter how many people are a little bit worse off as a response to this. But now somebody else makes that same choice and they save a life. But it also decreases the responsibility of the government by a teeny tiny amount. And then another person does it, and another person does it, and another person. Now suppose we have 30,000 people doing it. After 30,000 people have done it, lots of teeny tiny grains of sand can add up to a massive hill. You may have, all of them together may have saved 30,000 lives, but they may have significantly reduced the responsiveness of the government to a citizen. And now that has a massive effect, not just on 30,000 people, but on millions of people. Every member of the country has worse roads, worse schools, worse hospitals, worse police force, worse defense system, worse pollution control, worse everything. 1 million people might be affected significantly because a lot of little tiny things that add up. So now we can see what Angus is saying, but we can see we face this dilemma. Because what Angus is saying is, I'm not asking the question of whether each one of us is doing more good than harm when we contribute to an agency. I'm asking about the global effect when millions of people contribute to aid agencies and tons of funds pour into very poor countries. And he says the global effect of lots of people giving to lots of aid organizations that are working on the ground in desperately poor countries is to collectively substantially reduce the responsiveness of the government to its citizens. And that is absolutely crucial, as I've said before, to the long-term global economic, political, and social health of the country. But now we face this dilemma because it's a genuine each we dilemma, as I've described it. If you ask me the question what I ought to do, I ought to save a life. It's like a lollipop for life case. I can help one person a lot at a tiny cost to lots of people. That's true for me, and that's true for everybody else. So it looks like each of us ought to bring about the outcome where we save a life rather than harm a lot of people a tiny bit. But while each of us ought to do that, we together ought not to do it. Since the outcome in which millions of people are significantly adversely affected is worse than the outcome in which 30,000 people die. So that could be the situation we face when it comes to global aid. We could face genuine each we dilemmas. These are very difficult to solve. The kind I just described, each we dilemmas of consequentialist morality are, I argue, the most difficult to solve. It could be that we have no answer to the problem. We know for sure what each of us ought to do. We also know what we together ought to do. And there is no ad hoc plausible way of reconciling these two oughts.
Yeah, a lot of points there. I wanted to one response that someone might have on the prisoner's dilemma and some of those other dilemmas. I'm not sure this will apply to some of the more complicated ones like the red and blue button and ones which involve the dispersed additional burdens principle. One response is to say what actually is optimal for the individual is to take the cooperative action. And if you're familiar with like evidential decision theory, some people will say, yeah, this is right because you have to take seriously correlations that obtain between the choices you make and the choices other people make, right? And if these things are really correlated, then, if I do this action, I can be somewhat confident that others will take the same one. And had I taken the other, then people would have probably taken that one too.
Yeah.
What do you think of this approach?
So I think that's not, I don't think that approach works. I think it fails to understand what's really going on in the prisoner's dilemma. So I'll just say a little bit about this, but then I'm gonna really suggest for people who are interested in this, and this is, I think, the philosophically most interesting contribution of the book. They should read that book. I mean, they should read my book. I'm not trying to make a plug for my book, but this is actually a very important issue, but it's very complicated, hard to do in a short interview. And it would also help if they actually read the relevant chapter of Rethinking the Good, but because that's useful background for this. But the vis-a-vis your evidential issue, let's just go back to the simple prisoner's dilemma. So you have to remember how the structure of the prisoner's dilemma was set up. Now, you can change it. I mean, there are lots of solutions to prisoner's dilemmas that consist in basically altering the structure so you're no longer in a true prisoner's dilemma. So, for example, if I'm faced with I can help myself a little or I can help you a lot, you can help yourself a little, you can help me a lot. And then after we make a decision, one of us can retaliate against the other based on their decision. So if I act in a trustworthy way to help you, but you don't act in a trustworthy way to help me, and afterwards I can come around and bash your head in for not cooperating, then we're no longer in a true prisoner's situation, dilemma, where we've changed the structure. So we're not in a prisoner's dilemma. The point about the structure of a prisoner's dilemma is you're in a situation where you know that whatever you do, it will be better for you if you do one thing rather than another. And you know that's true of them as well. Now it's true. I remember hearing, I mean, your comment is not a silly one by any means. I remember the first time I heard this issue discussed, say 40 years ago, I don't know the exact number, it was a long time ago, by Tom Nagel, a teacher of mine, one of the great living moral philosophers. And we were in a seminar and he was trotting out, that kind of response. He was basically saying, he's one of the greatest moral philosophers, of the 20th and 21st century. So he was basically saying, but look, if I'm a reasonable person and I assume that you're a reasonable person, I think that however I act, you're going to act. So, if I pick, the one that helps me, you're going to pick the one that helps you. And if I pick the one that helps you, you're likely to pick the one because you're not epistemically, you're not any different than I am. So obviously, if you're likely to do whatever I would do, then I should pick the one that helps you more. And then you're likely to pick the one that helps me more. And then we're both better off than if we act selfishly. So we've solved the dilemma. But that doesn't solve the dilemma at all. Because the point is, I know that whatever you're likely to do, I guarantee that I'm better off whatever you do. This is the point about the prisoner's dilemma. It's a dominant strategy. Whatever you do, I'm better off if I help me than if I help you. Because there's no causal interaction between us. It's not like if I do this, Hobbes solved the original prisoner's dilemma in his great Leviathan by having the Leviathan's mouth, the chains, he chained everybody's acts together. So whatever I did, you had to do. If whatever I do, you have to do, if our acts are literally chained together, then of course I'll pick the I help you more and you'll help me more because they're chained together. But if we've broken that chain, there's no causal interaction between us, then you either are going to help me or you're going to help yourself. If you help me and I help me, then I'm better off than if you help me and I help you. I have everything you gave to me and more. I have what I gave to me. If you help yourself and I help you, then I have nothing. If you help yourself and I help me, I have something. I have what I gave to me. Whatever you do, you're either going to help me or you're going to help you. All this stuff about evidential is just a red herring. It doesn't matter whether it's evidential or not. I could know for 100% you're going to help me. Then I should help me. I get more than if I help you. I could know for 100% you're going to help you. Then I should help me. Because I get more than if I help you. Whatever you do, it's got nothing to do with evidence, nothing to do with probability. Whatever you do, I'm better off in solely self-interested terms if I help me rather than if I help you. That's true for you as well. We both help ourselves. As a result, we're worse off in self-interested terms. So I'm afraid that this is actually not a solution to the prisoner's dilemma if it's a true prisoner's dilemma. Now, if you change the structure of it, tit for tat, we iterate it. We run it once and we see what we did. And then afterwards, we see what you did. And then I can respond. You didn't cooperate last time, so I don't have to cooperate last time. Now we've changed it from a single person prisoner's dilemma to a many person iterated dilemma. That's a different issue from the standpoint of what's in your own best interest. I grant that. But in the standard prisoner's dilemma, doesn't matter whether I have evidence for you being one way or another. I could know for certain how you're going to be. And I ought to act in my own best interest.
Yeah. So I think there's still room for pushback on behalf of the evidentialists. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'll just make a quick point. Probably want to wrap up soon anyway.
Sure, I think we should. Yeah. Well.
The evidentialist is going to say, the dominance argument is only good when your choices and the other person's choices are like evidentially independent, right? What actually you take tells you nothing about what the act the other person is likely to take. Because the idea is something like this, right? Suppose you perform the cooperative action and the other person does too. You want to say something like this, well, you could have done better, right? By not cooperating. They would have suffered by, the more prison, but you would have had less or none, however it is in the original problem. But what the evidentialist is going to say that this reasoning is flawed, right? Because when you're reasoning counterfactually, you're changing the action you took, but holding fixed the action the other person took. When in reality, these things are correlated, they're connected in a way. So they want to say, even if not causally. You understand the point?
Yeah, I think it's the causal that's relevant here. This gets into issues about nuclear paradigm. Let me push back one more time, and then this is probably take us, it's down an interesting hole in philosophy and in decision theory, but not so much what we should focus on in this book. And we should bring it to a close soon. But let me give what I often give in my examples as the crude original. I call this the Hobbesian dilemma, right? Hobbes famously claimed life in the state of nature was mean, boorish, nasty, and short. So imagine that, I'm sort of living in a state of nature, and I'm basically a kind of advanced ape-like creature, and I've got this great big club in my hand, and I come out and I see this thing in a clearing, and I really want this thing, a dead antelope or something like that. There's something there that I really want. I've got this great big club, and I'm going to go in and take it. And then out of the clearing on the other side comes another, sort of Neanderthal guy like me, and he's big and he's hairy and he's got a great big club, right? And so I'm sitting there, and we both want this thing in the middle, right? We both want it. And so we're not going to just turn. We want this thing. And I'm about to go in, and he's about to go in, and we have these great big giant clubs. And then, I'm sort of a Neanderthal, but, I got this human intellect going on. And then I think, wait a minute, this is crazy. If we go at each other with these great big clubs, we're going to bruise each other. We're going to bang each other. We're going to break each other's legs. We're going to be bleeding from wherever. Even the winner is going to be a loser. We're going to barely be able to enjoy, this carcass, whatever it is that we want in the middle. Even if we win, we're barely going to be able to eat it. We're going to be, we're going to be in terrible shape. On the other hand, if we throw away our clubs, we could just go sort of caveman away, it's, me against him, and we'll just duke it out, and one of us will win and one of us will lose. But, even the loser isn't that badly off, right? And the winner is, in much better shape. So I realize, and I get this into my head, and I start grunting to you to try to get you to realize it too. And so you do. And we both realize that, if each of us fights with our giant club, we'll be better off. And if each of us, if each of us fights, we'll be worse off no matter what happens, whether we're a winner or loser, than we would be if we both threw it away. We'd be better off for sure if we threw away the club and just went, So I grunt this out to you, and you comprehend it in your pea brain too, and so we both agree. I should throw away your club, you should throw away a club. So we come in together, and then I say, okay, I'm going to grunt on the count of 3. Grunt, grunt, grunt. Should I keep my club or throw it away? So I grunt, 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 grunt. Now it's 3. What should I do? Now this is a classic example of a prisoner's dilemma. because I should hang on to my club. And I should hang on to my club, whatever you do. You're either going to throw away your club or you're not. If you throw away your club, I have my club. I can beat the shit out of you. I can get what I want. I won't even mess up the pretty hairs in my face. If, on the other hand, I throw away my club and you hang on to your club, you're just going to destroy me. I'm just going to be dead in 2 seconds. I will have nothing. So you're going to hang on to your club or you're going to throw away your club. Whatever you do, I'm better off if I hang on to my club than if I throw it away. Now, that's true for you too. So, of course, we'll go at it and we'll both be much worse off because that's a classic prisoner's dilemma. Now, on your view, on the evidential thing, I'm supposed to be able to think, oh, whatever I'm going to do, he's likely to do the same thing. He's got the same Neanderthal brain that I've got. So if I throw it away, he's going to throw it away. If I hang on to it, he's going to hang on to it. So now the question, what's the rational thing to do? I'm hanging on to my club. I'm just hanging on to it. He may or may not do the rational thing. I have no causal control. Our acts have not been tied together. Telling myself, well, he's likely to do whatever I'm likely to do. I'm going to hang on to my club. I'm guaranteed to be better off, whatever he does. That's true for him too. I just don't think that's the solution. So anyway, we should bring this to an end. Yeah. Maybe you have one final question. I have one final comment I'd like to at least make. Look, so for most of my life, I thought it was clear that those of us in the West, and actually well-to-do people anywhere, it doesn't matter whether in the West or not, I thought it was clear that we had a moral obligation to help those people who are badly off wherever they are. And I was largely in the effective altruist camp that we should give it to the place where it would do the most good. And I was largely in the camp of thinking that the place where it's likely to do the most good, where you get the most bang for your buck, are going to be in the poorest countries of the world. I still think, and this has been my view stretching back 40 plus years, 45 years or more. I still think that if you want to be good in the world, if you want to be good in a world of need, you cannot ignore the plight of the world's needy. I still think both as individuals and collectively, we need to find a way to help those people who are really badly off. But what I now believe and what this book is about is that I used to think it was very easy to do that. I used to think, write a check, go on the internet, spend 10 minutes, perusing, the various internet sources that tell you the best charities to give to, giving what we can, or the life we can save, or, there's all these various things out there. And I can't believe I'm blanking on the most important one. But anyway, find out what they most recommend with their highest rated charities, send a check there. I just was always sure that was the way to go. I no longer am. For all these reasons I've hinted at, I think there's lots of reasons to worry about whether we, each of us, either individually or we collectively, are doing more good than bad when we intervene in some of the world's poorest regions, particularly those that are run by corrupt regimes, despots, warlords, etc. But that doesn't, and I want to get this out there, this is very important to me, that doesn't mean we can wash our hands of this. I think we have to look individually and collectively for other mechanisms of aiding those in need. And there are many such mechanisms we can try to pursue, other than by just simply giving to on-the-ground relief agencies. Many of the plight of the worst off individuals in the world, many of these result from international institutions, international financial and legal institutions that drastically tilt the playing field in favor of the well-to-do and against the poorly off. There are so many laws, international laws, patent laws, property rights laws, and just a gazillion laws that favor the well-to-do over the poor. If you want to really help the worst off people in the world, as I do actually, we need to find a way of revising some of those laws And unlike many people, I don't think it's enough to make sure that the people in the poorest countries, the worst off people in the poorest countries, are operating on a level playing field, which they're not currently given international laws. It's not enough to get them on a level playing field. They've been dealt such a bad hand initially. If there's to be any hope of genuine, what I regard as fairness in this situation, we need to not just try to level the playing field, we need to tilt the playing field in their favor. And so much of what we do as individuals and as nations is the exact reverse. Even as we say we want to help people in need, we are setting up roadblocks directly or indirectly through our representatives to their being helped. That's something I think that we need to work at and that we can work on without necessarily incurring many of the large costs that we're talking about here. But I will end with just this thought. There are some cases, so I've already said I'm not just an effective altruist. I think there's more to being good than just doing the most good. I believe there might be some cases where the humanitarian need is so urgent and so pressing right now that a good person has to respond to it, even if long-term it would do more harm than good. I just think that's a possibility because of the nature and complexity of morality. That's what I have to say.
Thank you so much for that. That's a good place to end, I think, as well. Yeah, you've given me a lot to think about, and I think maybe some people will be looking forward to this book when it comes out.
I hope so. Thanks, Troy. I appreciate your interviewing me, and best wishes with everything.
Thanks so much for taking part.